Welcome to the Ryerson Negotiation Project. My guest today is the Honourable Lisa Raitt, Federal Minister of Labour and also the Member of Parliament for the Federal Constituency of Halton. Welcome to our show.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Good to be here.
Well, you've had a remarkable career. After graduating from law school, I'm told that you went to London, England.
I did.
And you studied or worked with a barrister. Could you tell us about that?
Well, the Law Society of Upper Canada has this really unique opportunity to exchange between the Law Society here and the bar over in the UK experiences, meaning lawyers who've been qualified. So I had been called to the bar, and I was one of the recipients of the Harold G. Fox Scholarship, and I went to England, and I basically followed 3 different barristers around for the period of a year, which included the ability to sit with a justice on the High Court, sit with a justice in the Court of Appeal, and really soak it in, what it's like to be a barrister as opposed to what it's like to be a solicitor, which we do a lot of work here in Canada.
So then you come back to Canada, and then you assume a very senior executive role as the Chief Executive Officer of the Toronto Port Authority.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, it wasn't instantaneous. There's a piece in between. Between getting called to the bar and going to London, I found myself not in the profession of law, and really tough to get a job for somebody who's going to be leaving in September when you're unemployed in April. So and this is an honest-to-gosh story, I went to Kelly Temp Agencies because being from Cape Breton, you have to work. And my skill set, although was law, and I have a chemistry degree too, I was a really good typer, and I'm really good at that kind of clerical work. And I thought I can get a job temping for the summer. And I ended up getting placed with the chairman of the Toronto Harbour Commission. His name was Harold Perry. And I became his liaison between the Harbour Commission itself and the chair's office, and his office is at Mandrake Consulting, or Mandrake Management Consultants. And through that experience, when I was in London, I kept in touch with the management of the Harbour Commission, became a port authority, and they realized they needed some legal expertise. Since I understood the transfer from a Harbour Commission to a port authority, they called me, and I came in as general counsel. It was very fortunate, but it's the right place at the right time kind of thing. And obviously, I worked out for them, so it was positive. Yeah.
Tell us about how you developed the mandate at the Port Authority. You've had multi-stakeholders that you would have to work with. How did you develop that mandate?
The port had just come through a very, I would say, difficult time, and it followed it for a number of years when I was there. And the main contention was that some folks had decided that it should be a federal port, and others were still opposed to the notion of it being a federal port. And as a result, we really had to develop a mandate that showed that it was an important piece of Toronto and national infrastructure. So we set about, you start with the Act, because that's my training, I'm a lawyer. You take a look at the Act and you see, well, what is our role? What has Parliament said we're supposed to do? And you flesh that out and you really work with your stakeholders. But at the end of the day, it's a business, and nothing is more important to business than good interpersonal relations. And that translates as well too, not only to the people you do business with, but the people who work with you in the business. And that's where I first started developing what ends up being, I guess, the way I approach negotiations in a union setting.
So let's come back to the relationships. I mean, you focused on that. You had multi-stakeholders at the Port Authority.
Yeah.
I would think that our viewers would deem it pretty important, that those relationships. How did you work at those?
A lot of it has to do, relationships are about personality and listening. It's a lot about listening. And as the Port Authority, my job was to listen to the stakeholders and what they wanted. Doesn't mean I always agree with them, with what they can get from the Port Authority, and that can be in business deals or even in interacting with the City of Toronto, which was always a very difficult conversation. But you still need to listen to people, and you still need to give information out and bring it in.
Would that be the kernel in terms of developing good relationships, the listening skills?
I think that's exactly what allowed me to be successful later on. And maybe it's because in Cape Breton, you grow up, especially if you're the young person in the family in a room full of adults, you do a lot of listening, because when I grew up there, it was children are to be seen and not heard. It's not the way that I raised my kids, but it certainly was the way I was raised. and that you know that when there are people in the room who have a good deal of information, it's worth your time to have a listen to what they have to say. But I think that's the key for me. It's listening so that you can then analyze and adapt.
Now, at the Port Authority, how many stakeholders were there? You had the federal government,
Yeah.
and that was, the statute was a federal statute.
Correct, yeah.
You had the provincial,
Yes, we did. We had a provincial representative on the board.
a municipal
We
representative?
did, yeah.
And what other stakeholders?
And community. So the board itself, and that I did a lot of work with the board as corporate secretary, very fascinating. Five members came from the federal government. One of them was the federal appointee, the direct federal. The other three came from user groups. So the user groups were the shippers, another user group was airport users, another user group were recreational boaters, which is an amorphous organization, but still important to have contact with. And the fourth one was other business enterprises that were not port and not airport related, because the Port Authority had other kinds of entities on their board. So it was plus the political appointees. But the board wasn't allowed to have politicians on it, so these were just members of the community who represented the views of their, I guess, stakeholder at the end of the day.
How different were the interests, say, for instance, with the municipal representatives versus that of the federal representatives?
Completely at opposite ends. Depending upon the politics of the day, you could have a municipal representative who quite simply thought the assets of the port should lie with the municipality. And the federal side, of course, we had gone through the process of creating the Port of Toronto into a national port, and wasn't an appetite to undo it necessarily. The most interesting, I have to say, I wouldn't say conflict, but the one that we had to balance most carefully was the interface between recreational boating and users of the airport. Because as you land at City Centre Airport, and I'll call it Billy Bishop, there's a clearance area where you can't have any vessels because of the way the plane comes down, the masts go up, a buffer needs to happen. And some of the most difficult conversations were with Transport Canada on navigation, Transport Air with respect to what the planes needed, and the recreational boating community. And I think we ended up getting to the right place on it. And that would have been the most practical example of trying to negotiate your way through and balance everybody's interests. Now, stakeholders are always going to say that you took one side over the other, but they're functioning now, so it's working out.
In terms of your preparation time as a CEO, with those different stakeholders, you've developed relationships, you've practiced your listening skills. But what sort of preparation time would you have to put in, say, for instance, for board meetings, developing the strategic plan, et cetera?
George Adams, when he sat on the bench, did a tour for incoming law students when I was at Osgoode Hall. And we had a tour, and he was asked, what's your best piece of advice? And it's always stayed with me. And it's about preparation, and it's not about skimping. You have to be ready. And you just can't read whatever's presented to you. You have to do your own research. I do my own research all the time. I have lots of staff. I have lots of staff who print stuff out for me. But you will see me on my iPad looking things up on my own volition. I follow a variety of people on Twitter so that I can ensure that I understand what's happening in the United States, for example, in the labor fields. I follow all of the unions here in Canada. I don't always like what they say about me, Dave, but I follow them nonetheless, because that's your best piece of information. The more information you have at your disposal, the more facts, the better your negotiation is going to be, because you're coming from a place of certainty as opposed to where you're just trying to skate through. There's no, this is an axiom, it's an old truism. There is no substitution for good, hard work. And that's just, you have to do it. And you can't skate, because you get into a room and you start negotiating, and the other side is going to know if you're just trying them on to see how far they can go.
So long hours in terms of reading, analyzing.
Yep, 100%. I mean, you have to be ready. So I will spend, it's rare, we'll probably talk about this later. I don't get involved in labor negotiations in the country until we are at mission critical stage. By that time, I will have had about 3 weeks of understanding what the issues are.
We'll come to that in a second.
So it's important.
2008, you enter federal politics.
Surprise.
Tell us about that. Tell us about that.
Well, for anyone who's interested in politics, especially women, I don't know where I ended up getting the ability to be risky, but I did. That was a huge risk I took. I ran against Garth Turner.
So you resigned from the Port Authority?
I did, and I took a leave of absence without pay. I was the sole breadwinner in the family, and it's 6 weeks without a paycheck coming in, and that's scary. And I sometimes wonder, where did it come from? But it happened nonetheless. It worked out for me, very grateful, and made the decision to run. I had always been around politics. I followed your career when I was growing up, of course.
Oh my goodness.
I did. My family was politically involved on the local municipality side. My grandfather, Colin McCormick, was an alderman in Sydney and a member of the union, secretary-treasurer. So I've always been around politics, and I knew I was going to end up there one day. I just didn't think it would be then. But politics is timing. You know this. And if you think that your time's going to go by, you get one in it, especially in the Conservative Party. The last time Conservatives were in power was 1992, and it was an opportunity, and the timing was good.
Here's this young lady, very well educated, CEO of a very prominent corporation, takes a leave of absence, is running in a federal campaign for 6 weeks. What was it like rapping on doors and asking people for their vote?
Only you could ask that question, because that's the scariest thing in the world. It's I went through all my life never asking for anything, providing answers, providing solutions, trying to negotiate. Never once did I have to go up to somebody and ask for something, and I found it to be a really difficult process. The beginning too, I had no volunteers. If you recall, in 2008, the Raitt was dropped really quickly, so we're kind of found flat-footed. I didn't start my campaign until a week into the campaign. And I had my stepfather, Frank Starzomski, and a good friend of mine, Nicholas Papalardo, who basically door-knocked with me every day for 21 days, and we didn't have anybody else helping us until it started to build momentum. So it was the three of us just going to the door, and you learn a lot. And Frank had done door-knocking, of course, in Cape Breton. I don't think Nicholas had. And you just learn along the way. And I look back, and they're possibly some of my most fondest moments, because we didn't know what we were doing, and it was just contacting people and reaching out. The 11 campaign was different, lots of volunteers, lots of help. Still did the door knocking every single day. We had 30,000 homes, but we could do that because we had so much more help in terms of being able to go out ahead and find the doors that were open.
In 2008, you're rapping on doors.
Yeah.
Come across anybody that says, "I'm not voting for you"?
Absolutely.
How did you handle that?
Thank you very much for telling me, because a lot of times people won't tell you. You know what I found the hardest is when I'd run into the Scottish people who would say, "I'm not telling you who I'm voting for," because that's exactly what my grandmother, Christina McCormick, would say to me. Tootsie would say, "I am not telling you who I'm voting for. It's none of your business." And of course, we want to find out, because we want to be able to make sure that people who are voting for us go and vote that day. So when they didn't vote for me, I said, "Okay, thanks for telling me." It's when you get into arguments. Did I have rude people? Yeah, you have that. Some people have, they had no preconceived notions of me, but they certainly had preconceived notions of my party. And as a result, you would hear all the bad stories from them. But
Bad words?
Oh, for sure.
Door slammed in your face?
Yeah. Not many, though. Not many. Not many. Canadians are very kind.
They treat you differently because you were a woman?
Yes.
In what way?
The biggest question I got was, how can you be a young woman and be a conservative, to be honest?
And how would you respond to that?
I'd laugh, and I'd say, "But I am, and I'm running for the Conservatives." And then I would go into my spiel of why. But in the 11 campaign, I had all women who went with me. I'm a big proponent of gender equality in all aspects, and specifically in politics. So everybody would be under 30, all women. They got that a lot more than I did, and they would laugh at it too. But nobody derogatory, more quizzical. But I did have, there are some diehard people who are partisans out there who want to make sure that they get their pound of flesh out of you before you leave.
Would it be fair to say that this was helpful in the sense that it helps you develop a pretty thick skin?
Yep.
Because you then go into politics, and then you are elevated
Yeah.
to the federal cabinet.
John Tory on campaign said, you never know if you're going to get in cabinet or not. It's a gift, and I don't even know how cabinet is made up. It's a decision made by the Prime Minister in his purview. But John Tory said that if you look at all the factors, you're probably going to go in, and he said it's going to be like a helicopter comes in, picks you up, and then when it's all over, they'll drop you back off again, and it's a whirlwind in between. And a lot of truth in that. I didn't have a thick skin coming out of that election at all. I may have had a bit. I had very tough times at the Port Authority, highly contentious issues, lots of media interaction. Nothing prepared me for what happened as a minister.
Tell us about that. And tell us about the learning curve. I would think that many in the viewing audience would say, okay, highly intelligent lady, she's done very well, she becomes a federal cabinet minister. But share with us the kind of work ethic that you have to survive as a minister at a federal cabinet. Yeah,
it's like that. If you used to watch the Lawrence Welk show or one of those shows where you'd have the guy with the broomstick and you're spinning the plates and he's running back and forth trying to keep all the plates spinning, that is a pretty good analysis of what's going on, with no rhyme or reason as to which plate falls off at what point in time. So as a minister, you need to deal with your constituency, you need to deal with your portfolio, you need to deal with the politics, both writ large and writ small within your own party. And I have gender politics to deal with. And then you have your family. And my kids were 6 and 3. So, I look back on it and I was balancing a lot, and some fell, some plates crashed to the ground, some plates kept going. But I was able to do enough to be able to ensure that we made it through the 11 campaign. But I would say in terms of the learning curve, I never found it difficult to understand my portfolio. I never found it difficult to know on the business side what needed to happen. It was the politics side. I didn't know anything about the procedures in the House of Commons, how things worked in Ottawa. It's a very, you know what it's like, it's a very different place. And how I fit in, and how every time a new MP comes in, they change what the bubble looks like. So I changed the bubble a little bit and try to find my way, and then you settle into where you think you're what best suited in terms of how you live your life. So right now my life is up at about 7 or 8, and you do your duties, you take your appointments, and you conclude about 9 or 10 that night. So it's a long day, but I do it Monday morning to Thursday night, and then I'm in the riding, and that's the best part.
So over this period of time, you've obviously encountered difficult people, whether they be in the constituency, whether they be other ministers, whether they be stakeholder groups, etc. How has Lisa Raitt developed an ability to deal with difficult people?
Sometimes you can still end up having somebody get under your skin, but I can identify where the topics are, where they do get under my skin, and I have really good staff to extract me from bad situations. When somebody just comes up to you and starts yelling at you, somebody else has to step in and remove you, because you can't have a confrontation, because that'll be the story. So I guess what I've learned is hold your tongue and walk away as best you can, extricate yourself. And that's mainly when you're confronted in a public situation. You encounter difficult people at the table when you're negotiating, or at the table when you're talking to members of the opposition. And what you do in that case is you just revert back to the listening mode and wait for the temperature to come out of the room and let it finish. But for those random ones where somebody just wants to come up and attack you for a reason, just walk away. That's the only thing that you can possibly do, because it'll escalate.
That's very wise advice, even in our day-to-day activities. I mean, if someone wants a confrontation, probably that's the best way to do it.
I don't seek out confrontation, and I do try to diffuse it that way. Even with my kids, I'm very, very patient. I try very much to hold my tongue and move on. There's a lot of people who enjoy the fight. Was never my thing. Even in Cape Breton, was never my thing.
So patience is an important quality as well.
It is. It is.
Have you had to practice that? Have you had to learn that skill?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely, and I think I honed it since '08. I was very impatient, but impatience is good in a sense, because if you're too patient, you can get yourself into paralysis where nothing ever happens. But you need to find that mix. You got to continue to push forward and try to move the agenda and move the ball forward, but manage your patience in the sense that you don't become so overwrought that you blow up the entire process. Look, it's about thinking big game, 30,000 feet at all times. What do you want to accomplish in the overall piece that you're trying to move forward and develop your way? I approach every situation the same way. I look at it from the highest level and try to figure out what the end result is I want and plot how to get there. And sometimes it's about being patient, sometimes it's about pushing, and I think that's why I like labor.
You have to have that balance.
You have to have the balance, and you have to develop the experience to know when you use what. Give you an example. If you're the type of person who rants and raves at every small little thing, after a period of time, nobody listens to you anymore because you're going to overreact on everything. It's the boy who cried wolf. But if you try to balance it out and you're patient, you save that moment of, I guess, impatience for a particular time in the process, and people understand that, okay, I've taken her as far as I can, and now I've got to give, or I've got to move forward, because everything in life is negotiating. Everything in life. Going to dinner, where do you want to go to dinner? That's negotiating. Even when somebody says, I don't know where to go, that's negotiating, because you don't always want to make the decision. So.